Well, after more than a month of coronavirus restrictions, some states and territories have begun easing physical distancing rules. Queenslanders can now travel up to 50 kilometres from their homes for recreational purposes. Some national parks have been reopened for activity, but outings are still limited to members of the same household or an individual and one friend. The ACT has generally fallen into line with the relaxations permitted in New South Wales, where groups of 2 adults and their children can now visit other households in a bid to reduce social isolation. Sydney's eastern beaches have also been reopened for exercise only between 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. daily. Lifeguards will be on hand to enforce social distancing. Up to 10 people can gather in Western Australia as long as appropriate social distancing measures are adhered to. A number of non-contact recreational activities are also now allowed, including fishing, hiking and sailing. The Northern Territory has had the biggest wind back, with top-end residents no longer subject to the 10-person rule or any attendance limits for weddings and funerals. A number of national parks and playgrounds have also been reopened for recreational activity. Restrictions are still in place in Tasmania and South Australia, as well as Victoria, which remains under a state of emergency declaration until the 11th of May. Well, let's get more on the easing of restrictions in Queensland. Jennifer Huxley joins us now from Burleigh Heads on the Gold Coast. Jennifer, just what restrictions have been eased there in Queensland this weekend?
Well, look, to be honest, the most popular restriction that's been eased this weekend is picnicking. Queenslanders are allowed outside to sit on the picnic blanket and lap up some rays before things get pretty cold this winter. And of course, that is observing social distancing rules, just with 1 or 2 people from your own household. If they're not from your household, from your family, then of course just one other friend. But you can see behind me here at Burleigh, it's a pretty popular picnic spot. So there's plenty of people making use of that new opportunity. Other restrictions that have changed. You're now allowed to travel within a 50-kilometre radius of home. Some national parks are now open, but if you're heading out, make sure you check which ones are, because there are some in Queensland, some particularly popular spots which are staying closed at this stage. And another very popular restriction that has changed is that recreational boaties are allowed out, jet skiers are allowed out, and fishermen and women can fish to their heart's content, as we heard from a few of them at the Spit earlier this morning.
I think everyone feels a little bit happy about it. Hopefully in a couple of weeks' time we get to do a lot more. But yeah, it's nice to be able to go out and fish. Didn't catch any fish though.
It's great, but the weather's obviously not the most amazing. It's a bit cold today, but yeah, no, it's really good to get out there. As soon as I heard the news, I was like, yep, got to get out no matter what. So yeah, got on, and it's a bit windy, but that's all right.
Now, Jennifer, of course, Gold Coast beaches will be closely watched there. How is physical distancing being policed?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And Gold Coast beaches were, I guess, a little bit of a flashpoint earlier on around Easter. The local council took the liberty of closing 3 of the most popular ones because there was a concern that people were travelling from places like Brisbane and Logan and causing sort of crowding at particular spots. But all beaches and car parking here now open. Of course, police, though, have increased their patrols. We've just been observing here at Burleigh Heads, which is a very popular spot, both with locals and the drive market, holiday markers and day trippers, that they've been down on their all-terrain vehicles, just going up and down on the sand, keeping an eye on things. And then, of course, up on the Burleigh Headland, which is another very popular picnic spot, keeping an eye on people there. Now, we are a long weekend here in Queensland at the moment, so people, the patrols are still on the beaches, but they'll wrap up this weekend. But no flags, no crowding, but keeping a very close eye on people there.
Well, the World Health Organization has extended its declaration of a global health emergency. Globally, more than 3.2 million people have been infected and almost 240,000 have died. As the UK death toll rises, the British government says there has been an unprecedented jump in coronavirus testing. The majority of US governors are relaxing their state's pandemic restrictions as several protests take place against the lockdowns. More than 2,000 people are dying every day from COVID-19 in the country. But there's a disparity between states that have high infection rates, mostly on the east and west coasts, and those that have relatively few infections. North America correspondent David Lipson has more from Washington.
In a word, they're responding quite slowly. They are responding cautiously. It seems that there hasn't been a mad rush on the restaurants that are reopening in various states, and in certain states, shopping malls, restaurants, as I mentioned, also movie cinemas are all now opening for business. More than 30 states will have eased restrictions by next week. And they're all doing it at various degrees, various levels of easing restrictions. And that's because, as you mentioned, every state tells a very different story. The states around New York, for example, which are pretty tightly packed in terms of population centres, well, they're still struggling with the COVID-19 crisis, although most are seeing declining rates of infections. They are not really talking about opening for business anytime soon. Similarly, on the west coast, you see that they are not planning on easing restrictions, but in the geographical centre of the United States, many states are starting to ease restrictions. Texas is a good and somewhat controversial example. They are reopening movie cinemas, barbers and hairdressers, also shopping malls and restaurants at 25% capacity. But just yesterday, Texas recorded its deadliest day in terms of the coronavirus. More than 50 people died just yesterday, taking the total number in that state over 800. So people in that state, even though they are allowed to go out and start resuming something akin to business as normal, many of them are being pretty cautious about it, and workers are pretty worried about being told that they have to come back to work. If you look at Michigan, which has in many ways been the epicentre of many of these protests, they've had a number of protests. We saw another one yesterday, armed protesters actually gaining entry to the Capitol building, the state legislature, to demand that the state be reopened. There was a vote going on late last night for whether or not it should reopen, and they didn't make a decision, so the governor stepped in and decided that it wasn't going to reopen. So in that case, the governor has not taken notice of those protesters, no matter how loudly they were shouting about it. And it has to be, again, pointed out that these protests are pretty small, but they are widespread. I mean, we saw these fairly rowdy protests in California today, where protesters are angry that the beaches there around LA have been closed because they reopened, and we saw a similar thing to what we saw in Australia. We saw people surging to those beaches. They say that they were still social distancing, but the governor decided to shut down the beaches. We've seen mounted police sort of pushing back protesters today that were surging across the road. So the protests go on. They are small. I think that they're probably not having a huge effect on the governors as they make decisions as to whether or not to reopen. The University of Minnesota, it's put out a report suggesting that the coronavirus here in the United States could drag on for another 2 years, that we could be seeing infection rates spike, go up and down, fluctuate. They modelled 3 different scenarios, and in one of those scenarios in particular, there would be a very substantial resurgence of the virus at the end of this year as winter closes in. And it also suggests that somewhere around 2/3 of Americans would need to have been infected for this virus to really subside. That's not taking into account an early vaccine, which is still very much a big unknown. And the study itself really just does underline previous studies that have been done in other countries, but it does very much underline the danger as well that the United States is facing. And even Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's one of the top advisors here in the United States, particularly in the White House, in terms of health and infectious diseases, well, he is somewhat worried about all of the states that are starting to reopen for business, and has raised those concerns publicly as well.
The British government has announced that it has reached its target of having more than 100,000 coronavirus tests performed in a day. The total number of virus deaths in the UK passed 27,000. That figure taking into account deaths in care homes. With the Prime Minister Boris Johnson saying the country has passed the peak of the outbreak, the government has prioritised testing as the key to relaxing lockdown restrictions and avoiding a second spike in cases.
I can announce that we have met our goal. The number of tests yesterday, on the last day of April, was 122,347. This unprecedented expansion in British testing capability is an incredible achievement